everybody. I'm Caryn Hartglass. You are listening to It's All About Food. Guess what we're going to talk about today? Yeah, it's related to food. And I am very thrilled to bring on my guest. Nicola Twilley is the author of Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, the book Frostbite. Nikki is co-host of the award-winning Gastropod podcast, which looks at food through the lens of history and science, and which is part of the Vox Media Podcast Network in partnership with Eater. Her first book, Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine, was co-authored with Geoff Manaugh and was named one of the best books of 2021 by Time Magazine, NPR, The Guardian, and the Financial Times. She is a contributing writer at The New Yorker and the author of Edible Geography. She lives in Los Angeles. Welcome, Nikki, to It's All About Food.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I just wanted to note that your wonderful podcast, Gastropod, I noted was number 8 in the Feed Spot Best 70 Food Podcasts. And I'm only bringing that up because It's All About Food was number 14. So we're a little bit behind you, but it's nice to be noted.
Yeah, that's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
We're in good company.
Yeah, and I was curious to find out about you and your writing and your podcast because I do appreciate connecting the dots between food and science and throwing in history in there, of course, because it's also very important to understanding why we are where we're here, why we are where we are today. And if we want to make things better, kind of helps to understand where we came from.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think that's what's so exciting about Frostbite is this idea that, you know, we have been able to add heat to food since before we were modern humans. I mean, in some ways, you know, anthropologists and historians think being able to cook food is part of what made us modern humans and kind of fueled the growth of our brains, etc. But refrigeration is so recent. Really only 150 years we've been able to kind of produce it at will, and 100 years that we've domesticated this. So our power over the cold end of the thermal spectrum is such a recent thing and then so transformative. And I feel as though the reason to know that is because, well, then it's a lever. We can use it to change our food system. Seeing its power over our food system and the transformations it has wrought, this change in how we preserve food, how transformative it has been for what we eat, where it's grown, how it tastes, how good it is for us, for our planet. All of those things are things that have, you know, once you see the impact, well, then you can use your choice of food preservation and rethink our relationship with refrigeration to remake those into, you know, we all know our food system needs remaking. Well, here's a tool.
I was very surprised as someone who is passionate about food from all points of view, how little I knew about refrigeration.
Same. And
is it because it's so new? I mean, only 100, 200 years old, or it's just so ubiquitous right now that we take it for granted.
It's ubiquitous. We take it for granted. And I also think that, and this is not, you know, in some conspiracy theory type way, but folks have sort of gone out of their way to make it invisible. I think, you know, one of the interesting things that came up while I was researching this book is that when refrigeration was first introduced, it was met with deep suspicion, deep suspicion. People thought it was potentially immoral. We were interrupting sort of the natural process of decay and death. People thought that it was definitely a scam. You know, previously, if you had bought a chicken and it looked fresh, you knew that it couldn't be more than a couple of days old and come from more than a couple dozen miles away. It just couldn't possibly be anything other than that recently harvested. And now you could buy a chicken and it could be 2 years old. It would have been held in cold storage and, and defrosted, and you had no way of knowing. So that it really interrupted the trust. People felt like it was a scam. It was unnatural. It sort of interrupted the known physics of freshness. It was really deeply disturbing to folks, which is something you still see in parts of the world where refrigeration isn't widespread today. When I was in Rwanda for the book, traders there told me if they sell food that has been meant for export, and has been held in a cold storage, but then it hasn't been exported and can be sold in the local market, they have to leave it out in the sun to be able to sell it because there's this mistrust. Where is it from? And
Mm-hmm.
so when you think about that and the fact that we have now sort of completely reversed that, it's been a very sort of conscious effort by food manufacturers, packers, shippers, wholesalers, supermarkets to kind of take our mind off the idea of proximity and age and into other markers of freshness, like it saying fresh on it, or the fact that it has to be refrigerated. So even the sell by or use by date, which emerged, this is a story I tell in the book, it emerged out of, Congress looking at the idea of should we mandate that manufacturers, processors have to put on their labels when this food was harvested, when this food was made, right? And that way we would know how old it is.
Mm-hmm. Not good.
Well, the food business was like, we don't want you to know how old it is. We have no interest in you knowing how old it actually is. Not that it's not good, but just don't
Mm-hmm.
don't trouble your heads with that. Instead, we will come up with our own system, which is a use by or a sell by or a best before, which is a completely fictional sort of construct. It's just sort of how long they think it'll be good for, with some safety room. Has no the only thing that is federally regulated is infant formula. That
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm.
you can't that the sell by use by on that is federally regulated. Otherwise it's all at the state level, but then half the states don't have any regulation, and the states that do, it varies. So milk will go bad a week earlier in Montana than it will anywhere else in the rest of the country. And as far as I know, there's nothing different about how milk ages in Montana. So it's completely
Very
illogical, but
random.
exactly. But it was a food industry response to this question that refrigeration sort of made, raised, which is how old is our food now? And I think the food industry, without being really, I'm not trying to say they're trying to hide something from us, but they don't want you thinking about how old your food is and where it's from and where it's come from. That stuff is all supposed to be behind the scenes. And so refrigeration has been part of that. It's been behind the scenes. When I worked in a refrigerated warehouse, the folks there were like, I think what we do, it feels completely invisible. And I think that's true. And that's part of why I wrote the book, is just to say, this is what makes our food system possible, and we don't see it.
So I read your book. I just finished it this morning, and I got many things out of it. And on one hand, I'm appreciating all that refrigeration has brought us. And on the other hand, it raised a lot of alerts for me, like, maybe there are some things here we need to be considering. Now, I knew when Project Drawdown came out that refrigeration was the number one thing they were talking about to reduce human-induced greenhouse gases. And I was glad you mentioned it. It came towards the end of the book. Oh yeah, there it is. But there are numerous downsides to refrigeration, and maybe we'll get to them, and as well as the advantages. But my familiarity was a number of things. I knew somehow that our apples weren't new when I got them in the store. Somebody had told me, they're warehoused in some cold area, and we get them when they're not in season, and we need more apples to meet the demand. Okay, I understood that a little bit. And from healthcare professionals, nutritionists, when we're wondering, should I eat fresh? Should I eat frozen? They assure us that frozen fruits and vegetables are just as good and sometimes better when it comes to nutrition because they are frozen in a specific way once they're harvested and brought, right to our freezer, as opposed to fresh food that can travel a long way. And we know that as food ages, it loses nutritional value. So, those are the things I knew. But
Which puts
really,
you
that
quite
was
a
it.
step ahead of the American public. When I have been telling people, listen, your apple might be celebrating its first birthday, and people are just like, what? And I just, it's a sort of sign. And I say this in the book, refrigeration has really divorced us from seasonality. And if you eat an American apple, if you buy it in the store in like late June, what do you think is going on? Apples are not being harvested then. It has to be nearing a year old. And the point is people aren't thinking. And so you were already a step ahead. And most people don't know that produce is losing nutrients in the fridge. You pat
Mhm.
yourself on the back for eating that bag of spinach before it goes bad. But honestly, if you've left it in your fridge for a week, well, it has half of some of the nutrients it started out with when you bought it. And that was already less than it had in the field. I don't know if this has been driving me nuts. I've been seeing these Chipotle ads. I don't know
Mm.
if you've been seeing them. And it's all about, oh, yeah, no, this chicken isn't frozen. This chicken is fresh. This chicken is real. And
You
as
know
you,
better, right? You know better. It's
but
just not possible.
most people don't. And so I think that's really interesting. This sort of level of, even among people who know a lot about food and who think a lot about food, this is a blind spot, like you said.
I made a lot of notes and I'm not going to go in order of them. There's just too many of them. So as they come to me, I'll just pop them out. But talking about, is this fresh? I had a neighbor here. She died a few years ago, but the few times we would go out and she'd want the fish, she would always say, "Is the fish fresh?" And even when I didn't know about your book and what fish went through to get to the store or the restaurant, I knew it was a ridiculous question. What did you think? Somebody just was in a boat this morning and brought it to this ridiculous restaurant. Things like the idea of fresh. I don't even know what it is anymore. All I know is I was just in Europe and we went to farmers markets in France and the food tasted phenomenal and it was fresh, the fruits and vegetables.
Listen, the question of what freshness is so interesting to me because refrigeration it used to be bounded by constraints of time and space, right? You knew. And so it had to be in a certain season, it had to be harvested or slaughtered within a certain amount of time and a certain geography. There was just no way around that because otherwise it would have had to have been smoked or pickled or salted or something that transformed it into a way so you knew it was no longer fresh, it was preserved. Refrigeration just transformed that, and it threw the question of freshness up in the air. And the work that various USDA scientists, including Polly Pennington, who's one of the sort of
I
heroines
want to
of,
talk more
I
about her.
love her. So
Hmm.
she made Americans trust refrigerated food, but part of that trust was like, okay, so this is what freshness means. It means it has been refrigerated correctly. Now, toward the end of the book, I start talking about, could we have fresh food without refrigeration? And one of the sort of entrepreneurs working on a new technology for freshness says, hey, I think freshness should be, it has more of the nutrients and the flavor molecules and the good things that are the reason we want to eat it, that it had as more of those than it had than as many of those as it had in the field. Like the more of those you have, the fresher it is. A sort of chemical, biological definition of freshness. And I think That's closer. That's getting closer to what freshness really is. Like, are we as close to the moment of harvest as we can be? And I hear it all the time, and I experience it myself. When I had a journalist from Kenya come to a book talk of mine in Boston and say, "It's so interesting. I haven't been able to put my finger on it, but the food in America tastes dead." And like the produce, I just there's it
Mm-hmm.
looks good, but it doesn't taste a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And I said, yeah, it's there is, and no scientist will tell you, oh yeah, refrigerated produce is as good as freshly harvested, because it's not. The flavor, the nutrition suffers. It's just that that's how we get to have blueberries at Christmas, you know?
Okay. You have been very brave in writing this book, in going to places where no one really wants to go. And I'm quite surprised that there are people that work in these environments. So I know, being interested in food, that there are people that, especially in immigrants, and many of them who come into the country illegally, they're quite popular these days. They do a lot of the dirty work and a lot of the work that most Americans don't want to do, especially in slaughterhouses and things that are related to livestock. And then there's this whole refrigeration scene, and I'm just blown away that people work in these environments. You talked about visiting Americold and the coat that you had to wear, and how cold it can get and how deadly it can be if you're in it for so long, and all of the different things that are stored in these places, just mind-boggling.
Yeah, I so this was, and it was not easy to arrange
I
to
was
be able
wondering,
to,
they were
yeah,
happy to have you come and visit. Did you
there
have to
there was
sign a
some
million forms?
there was some back and forth between lawyers
Mm.
to get me in there, but I wanted to work. And I didn't work for an extended period of time. It was just a week's worth of shifts at Americold facilities here in Southern California where I live. But I really wanted to just understand what it's like to work in this environment. Who does this? What happens? What's going on behind the scenes of our food system, basically? And I know this is going to sound just really obvious, but it's cold. It's really cold. And they equip you with this sort of -50 gear. There's a company, Refrigeration, that sort of specializes in the wardrobe for people who have to work in the cold. Funnily enough, the hoodie was invented for people
Uh-huh.
working in cold storage units, some of the earliest protective gear. But, yes, it does. It's a warm piece of clothing, but it is tough in there. And when you are in the ice cream and frozen pizza section, it is you can't stay warm. It just doesn't work. And you have icicles forming on your eyelashes,
Mm.
your nose just runs constantly. People get sick a lot, and there's a scientific reason for that. You actually, and this is one of the most fascinating things. So, the way cold preserves things is by slowing down metabolism. It's just a really simple thing, it slows down time. So, for meat or milk or those kinds of things, what it's doing is slowing down the reproduction of the bacteria that want to eat that stuff and would make it go off, as far as we're concerned. For produce is still alive when it's harvested. It's still breathing, it's still metabolizing. And so, like us, it has a certain number of breaths it can take before it dies. And the deal with cold is it slows down that process. The fruit or vegetable is breathing slower, it's metabolizing slower, and so it lasts longer. But guess what? We're alive too. We are organic matter, and we slow down in the cold. Mountaineers call it cold stupid. Doctors, they call it the umbles. You mumble, grumble, fumble, and stumble. When they're planning the shifts in a refrigerated warehouse, you take how long that shift would take in an ambient temperature warehouse, and you add time. Because people just work more slowly in the cold. We think more slowly in the cold. Your reaction time is slowed in the cold. It is a tough, tough environment. And the folks who work there, they are the the engine that keeps our supermarket shelves stocked, but they are utterly invisible. They know they're invisible. They told me that. They said, before they worked in a place like that, like a refrigerated warehouse, they never believed such a thing would have existed. They would pick a yogurt up off the shelf without having any idea of what went
Mm-hmm.
into getting it to them. And it is just a really tough job. Increasingly, of course, it's hard to find people who want to do it. And this is something that a lot of minimum wage industries in tough environments in the US are finding is you can't find folks who have any other option who want to do it. And so what the cold storage industry is doing is mechanizing and
Ah, mm-hmm.
making it all automated. And so I visited one of these newfangled automated cold storage warehouses and rode the stacker crane through um, through the racks. And in some ways, that's a great thing because these are environments that are really
Mm-hmm.
tough on people and have actual health impacts. I mean, you tear muscles more easily in the cold. It raises your blood pressure. It's a tough environment on people. But of course, as things mechanize, these are tough questions around employment and what our society looks like. So, yeah.
So I'm a vegan for 36 years, I think now, 37, whatever. Long time, most of my life. And some of the things that concern me when I was reading the book is that refrigeration has enabled us to eat more animal products. In my opinion, that's not a good thing. And and I was reading your description at Americold talking about how the ingredients are all stored there that are put into burgers, reading about, the blood and the hearts and the livers, and like they're all separate and then they kind of all come together in a burger. And I don't know if people heard that, would they find that appealing?
You know what? I think
Especially
there's
especially the people that want the natural kind of meat, you slaughter an animal and you eat it rather than separating all the parts and freezing them and then putting them back together.
Listen, there's an amazing there's a geographer called William Cronon, and I have a quote of his at the end of the book, which it's about the invention of the refrigerated rail car and the impact that had on meat. But he says forgetfulness was among its biggest and most like least noticed impacts, and I think that's true. We're
Mm,
refrigeration is what made it possible for us to have industrial meat because you could raise meat at scale in parts of the country where no one ever saw them. I mean, previously, meat was slaughtered in cities where the people were. And so
mhm,
you could not avoid what it took to eat meat, which is slaughtering an animal. And the sights and sounds and smells of that, if you had to grapple with that.
mm,
And the price was also very high because there's huge savings if you can raise meat out where the land is, slaughter it there, and then ship only the parts that are edible. Well, half a steer is not edible, so you've just cut your shipping costs in half. Plus, you're raising the meat out in the middle of nowhere where there isn't union labor, so you've cut your slaughter costs. I mean, the price of meat plummeted after refrigeration. And because you're doing it all in one place at scale, now you can monetize byproducts. And so that's where you get into, well, now there's a use for pink slime, right? And I think so because it's scale, and again, that helps make meat cheap because you're making more money from the one animal. And American meat is the cheapest in the world. And people eat a lot of it for that reason. And the downsides of industrial livestock production are, I mean, like the immense cruelty, but also the environmental harms. And I mean, for me, the antibiotic use, which is a
mm.
public health emergency. I mean, these things are disastrous. And I think the only way that people can eat industrial meat, and I'm not a vegan, I do eat animal products, but I eat very selectively in the world of animal products. And I have very high standards for how my animals are raised. And I feel like if you have that awareness, it's hard to do otherwise. And we could all benefit, including the planet, from eating less meat too,
Hmm.
and better raised meat, at least if we're going to do it. And I feel like refrigeration has made that sort of forgetfulness possible. It's easy to not think about
Well,
when,
especially when everything is in packages and parts. You don't see the animal. You don't think of the animal. They're just pieces that you go to a supermarket and buy.
yeah, it's totally separated us from the realities of production and allowed those to be out of sight and mind. And I think that is a real disservice to us as eaters and to us in our relationship with the planet and the other creatures that inhabit the planet with us. So I do think, when you like, of course, there are, incredible benefits to allowing, people were undernourished in cities.
Hmm.
Animal products were a huge upside. Tuberculosis rates fell. There are public health benefits that have come out of having access to more protein. Could those have come from eating more beans? Maybe so. But, you know, but there
Yes.
are benefits. And it, to me, it's fine to acknowledge those benefits, but you have to also acknowledge the costs.
You probably heard this, but people say we would need, like, I don't know, many more Earths in order to grow animals like cows grazing on the planet rather than confined in factory farms because we don't have enough land mass to grow them, quote, humanely. I don't consider it necessarily humane, but in a way where they're not confined and in feedlots. Um, and then when you were discussing refrigeration and talking about Rwanda and their development with refrigeration, how refrigeration requires so many resources from the planet. We would probably need a few more planet Earths if we're going to really outfit everyone like we are in the United States.
That's right. We can't actually eat this much meat,
But it's not just
regardless.
meat, it's with
Yeah.
refrigeration.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's astonishing. This has been the interesting thing with refrigeration and development because on the one hand, you know, development agencies look at refrigeration and say, great, this is the way to lift people out of poverty. They can export and earn money for their agricultural products. Food waste is a huge problem, and it
Mm,
was in the U.S. The U.S. In 1916, the USDA surveyed this, and 30% of food rotted before it ever reached the market. Then you introduce refrigeration, and that number goes way down, way, way down. Um, what happens, of course, is that we waste the same amount of food, 30%, on the other end, at the consumer end. And one of the things I argue in the book is that's partly to do with this illusion of abundance that refrigeration gives us. You walk into the grocery store, and there's always more of everything. It's permanent global summertime, as it's being called. It's just you can have anything any time of the year, and you can have another of it if the head of spinach and a head of lettuce in your fridge has gone off. Buy another. It's cheap. And so that I know that people, like, food costs have been rising and people have been struggling with that, and we have a system that makes it very tough to sustain oneself these days. So no, you're not, I'm not like, oh gosh, we must all pay more for our food and nothing else should change. I just feel like our food system is broken, but we can't have, as the rest of the world refrigerates, which is the plan, we
mhm.
can't actually sustain that. So if the rest of the world had a US style cold chain, as it's called, um, our emissions from refrigeration would increase fivefold minimum. That's not even taking into account the fact that population is rising, so it would increase even more. And population is rising in the parts of the world that don't have refrigeration, namely Africa. And also that as temperatures rise, refrigeration becomes less efficient. So for every degree of temperature rise, refrigeration efficiency plummets.
Mm.
So it's actually, we're going to have to burn more power to refrigerate things as global temperatures rise too. So, but those emissions, if our refrigeration emissions increase fivefold, well, now they will exceed food waste emissions. They will, I mean, there will be, as one expert put it to me, we will be able to refrigerate anything. We just won't have a harvest to put in those refrigerated warehouses. So it's been this really interesting realization because on the one hand, a lot of development agencies have been promoting refrigeration, but in 2017, the UN was like, wait a minute here. Like, this is an environmental catastrophe, and had its first, I was a keynote speaker at their first meeting on sustainable cooling. There, and so
Mhm.
what does that look like? So it's a really interesting conundrum because also you can't just go to the developing world and say, we have this, but you can't have it because, you know, uh,
We know better.
exactly. What we have to do instead is something that says, hey, we've built this system. It has enormous downsides. Let's help. Like, you guys want the benefits of this system. We want you to have the benefits of this system. Is there a way to get them without some of the downsides? And I don't think you can do that without a full accounting of the downsides, which is why I wrote this book, because that hadn't been done.
I also got the impression that in the developing world where refrigeration is becoming more popular, it's not necessarily benefiting the local people. So they're tending to grow things that they can export rather than feed the poor folks that need the food. So
This is
some
a
people are
really,
making some money, but
right. This is a really interesting kind of dilemma of refrigeration. So, and one of the issues of this technology is that it tends to sort of encourage scale because it's an expensive
mm,
technology. So you're adding that cost. And to offset it, you have to be producing at a certain scale and selling at a certain scale. Well, in Africa, you're talking about tiny, tiny smallholders. Even companies that have been founded with a mission to work with smallholders in Africa and help them, refrigerate, they can't work with the smallest smallholders. They can't. It's not economic. The founder told me we can't do it. It's not economically feasible. I visited several cold storage rooms that had been funded by the European Union, funded by, USAID, and they weren't being used because they're too expensive to run. So it is really hard to make work at the small scale. And so instead, what happens is it works at the large scale, and the farmers that were already rich get richer. Even a Gates Foundation funded initiative to help farmers in Kenya refrigerate their milk. So this was, what could possibly be bad, right? Now the evening milk, they can store it overnight and bring it to market in the morning. Well, previously they were giving the evening milk to their kids because they couldn't store it overnight. Now they can store it and they can sell it. Well, you might think, and this, the woman who worked on this analysis was like, okay, well, great. Why shouldn't they have money? They can spend that on food for their kids. But no, they tend to, they might spend it on an iPhone so that they can do more business, which they need.
right.
They might spend it on repairing a leaky roof, which they also need to. But the kids, there was an actual dip in, there or a rise in malnourished kids after the introduction of refrigeration for this milk. Totally unintended side effect of this, intentional, like something that was intended to be a benefit to the community and did have benefits. Incomes rose, but malnourishment among the kids also rose. So yeah,
I don't know if
it's a tough
I don't know
call.
if you're familiar with Julie Guthman's book, The Problem with Solutions. Big fan of that book, and not necessarily a big fan of all of the philanthropy from the Gates Foundation because it seems like their belief is that technology will fix everything. And we need technology, but we need to look at the bigger picture before we invest and put something somewhere, understanding how the local economy works and what the people really need.
Right. It's hard. It can be hard to do. Like, I don't say that you don't, I mean, I don't say that I would have anticipated that outcome. And I think the important thing is you look at it and you learn from it and you say, okay, there's an issue here. How would we do this better next time? There's an issue around, one of the things I was looking at Rwanda is like, okay, so how do we deal with this scale thing? Can we do cooperative refrigerated warehouses so that the smallholders can remain smallholders but can aggregate at a different point in the system rather than only rewarding the large landholders. So you can, but still you have this problem of like, okay, so now you're growing, blueberries for people in the UK to buy. Well, that's great for people in the UK, but is it, and it is bringing cash into
Mhm.
a desperately poor country, but is it, you know, is this the model of development that we want to see or pursue 100%? Is it helping with local sustainable incomes, food resilience, um, you know, nutrition levels among kids and women? It's these things. I mean, I'm really glad I'm not in charge of fixing the world's problems because they are
Not just
huge.
reporting on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's
But
a
I
part
mean,
of it.
I do think that the solution always has to be to think about, and this is where we learn from history. These are things that we've seen happen to our own food system. So at least let's know that history as we go into the rest of the world and say, hey, can we do this better?
So talking about fruits and vegetables, which is what I'm all about, there's a lot of technology that has gone into keeping them fresh. And as you were talking about before, plants, when they're harvested, are still alive as compared to animals that are dead meat, which was an interesting term you used throughout the book, dead meat and live meat. I'm not sure how people respond to that, but I thought it was interesting. But fruits
That's
and
what it
vegetables,
was called, the dead meat trade,
the
which
dead meat trade.
no one would think that I'm just going down to the store to pick up some dead meat for dinner, honey. I mean,
Yeah, that made me laugh to myself quite a bit. Fruits and vegetables, they breathe. And in order to keep them fresh, we do a number of things. In the refrigerated area, we slow down their respiration, okay? But also while they're traveling, you talk about the plastic bags that they go in and the layers in the plastic. This fascinated me. I have a chemical engineering background, so the science and the chemistry was, extra interesting. But like some layers in order to allow the breathing, certain chemicals to leave the bag, certain chemicals to come into the bag. And we don't see any of that. It's a thin piece of plastic. That's just mind-boggling.
I know the salad bag thing blew my mind too. And again, so it's sort of astonishing, like I mean, like you, I've been in this field for decades. I've been reporting on food, caring about food, and still if you had told me that a salad bag is this
Somebody needs
like
credit for this. Somebody needs, to be famous. We need to know about these people.
it's astonishing, right? It's this incredibly sophisticated life extension technology that we just like take for granted. But absolutely, and I think, you know, a part of me was just genuinely in awe at the sophisticated regimes we have figured out to keep our fruit and vegetables, as fresh as possible for as long as possible. And, the people working in these fields are trying to preserve nutrients and goodness. So it's not, this is well intentioned work to maximize how fruit and vegetables respire in the environments we've built for them. It's just a really fascinating thing that has then also allowed, the fruits and vegetables that we eat are the ones that we have regimes for, these anti-aging regimes, I guess, like, so for example, I think most people who shop at a farmer's market will know that there are many more apples out there than we see on grocery store shelves, right? But the ones you see on grocery store shelves are the ones that can be there year round because they respond well to our atmospheric control regimes. And we have systems set up to keep those alive for a year or longer. And they've been bred for that too. That's the fascinating thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the story of the tomato is just amazing to me because everyone has had a supermarket tomato in the dead of
No
winter.
taste.
Taste of nothing. There's a reason for that. The genetic machinery that makes flavor has literally been bred out of tomatoes in the goal of making something that was so resilient and hardy that you could harvest it while it was green and unripe, ship it around the country, and then ripen it using the plant hormone ethylene at its destination. And so something that you can do that to in breeding for that, which is what the market, quote unquote, asked for, they accidentally bred out the machinery that makes flavor, which, as it turns out, is also the machinery that makes nutrients. So
Ah.
this was fascinating research. A guy at the University of Florida dedicated his career to being like, what the hell went wrong with supermarket tomatoes, basically. And he started by being like, okay, so what is flavor in tomatoes? And he did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of taste tests with people, and then looked at what those, what the tomatoes that people rated as the tastiest had in common. What were those flavor compounds? And he found, and what's the genetic machinery that's making those? And he found that the most flavorful tomatoes are also the most nutrient dense tomatoes, which makes a ton of sense because the entire like evolutionary rationale for our sensory system is to tell us what's good and what's not, what to avoid and what not. So it makes sense that a delicious tomato is better for us. And so he looked at contemporary commercial tomatoes, and that genetic machinery was gone, just totally gone. So he's made it his life's work to sort of try and breed that back in, which is a really interesting quest. Of course, if you refrigerate a tomato for more than 48 hours, 72 hours, you switch that machinery off anyway. So even
Mm.
if you have the most beautiful heirlooms from your backyard and you put them in the fridge for 3 or 4 days, they will no longer have the capacity to make flavor. You've
So
turned
that's
that
one of the
machine.
reasons why we're supposed to keep tomatoes out of the refrigerator,
I know. Just eat them. Don't stockpile.
right?
If
Just
there's
eat them.
one thing I've taken away from this book, it is do not stockpile. It is not good. Like nothing is getting better as it gets older.
I remember reading the book Tomato Land. That was
It's a good book.
Barry, what's his
Estabrook.
Estabrook. There we go. Yeah, I had spoken to him years ago when that book came out, and I learned so much about things like Florida law, where the tomato has to be a certain diameter and round in order to be shipped out of the state so that they could fit neatly on a hamburger.
It's incredible, isn't it?
But we don't
And
care if it has any flavor.
well, the market doesn't reward it. I mean, Harry, the Florida professor, said to me he's been at meetings where tomato growers have stood up and said, I don't get paid a penny more for flavor.
But this is the
Nothing.
United States.
Yeah.
This isn't other places. And maybe it's changing because we have this great influence and corporations have so much power. But like I just said, I was in Europe and there just seems to be maybe a little more interest in having their produce taste like something.
I think you can see this erode around the world. It was something, for example, I went to China
Mm.
to report the book, and that's a country that has built a cold chain basically overnight. They made it part of their 12th 5-year plan. And so you can see generationally, if you're over, 40, you care about flavor. You don't think refrigerated produce tastes of anything. And if you're under that, you think refrigerated produce is safe and that's the right thing to eat. And so it's an interesting, we are just so accustomed. I mean, I've had this happen in my own family where I have relatives, my husband's, side of it. I grew up in England, but his family are all here. And they've said to me, "Oh, I don't like peaches." And then I get them a farm stand peach that was
Oh,
harvested when it was ripe and has
mm.
never been refrigerated. And they're like, "Oh, I like this peach." And I'm like, "No, no. So what that means to me is you like peaches. You just don't like grocery store peaches, which I'm with you. They taste like nothing. And the
They have a
texture
bad
is horrible."
texture, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like they're not good. Just because you
Mm.
can have it doesn't mean you should have it, is what I
Exactly. I have a memory of when I was in college. I went to Bucknell in Pennsylvania. It was near the Amish, and they would have these market sales of peaches when they were ripe. They were just the most amazing fruit I had ever eaten. And I don't think I've had such a good peach ever since. They're really
It's
hard to
funny. My
find.
dream peach is from Pennsylvania too. With the Amish, have a thing going on with the peaches. You have to harvest it when it's ripe, which means it can't travel and it can't last, and you have
Exactly.
to eat it there and then and die of happiness on the spot, basically.
I'm not a big fan of the macrobiotic diet for a number of reasons, but I'm starting to appreciate their stress on eating locally and seasonally.
Yeah.
You talked quite a bit about the history, which was totally fascinating, about refrigeration and how it started with transport and all the trucks and the trains and the entrepreneurs that figured things out and went through a lot of expense. And some people profited from it and some people didn't. And you have to read the book to find out all those fascinating stories. And then how our own in-home refrigerators have changed over time from the, what was it called? The
Yeah,
monitor top
yep.
to the refrigerators that we have today. For some reason, the Honeymooners TV program with Jackie Gleason flashed in my head, and I remembered they had their ice box that they were always opening and slamming shut, and so different from what we have today. I am a very proud owner of a Sub-Zero that I bought 25 years ago. It has the compressor on the top, and
Ooh.
its depth is in line with my cabinet, so it's shallow and you can see everything. Nothing gets lost, nothing gets wasted.
Oh yeah,
Which,
you were yeah, that's and you know that issue of people struggle with it because they want more space. I mean, to me this is like freeways. People are like, "Oh, our freeways are so jammed. We need more, let's expand the freeways." Guess what? More traffic comes to fill up the freeways. It never works. You cannot get your way out of it, build your way out of a traffic jam like that. Well, it's the same with fridges. People are like, "Oh, I need more, I can't find anything. I need more space." And they get more space, guess what? They fill it and they can't find anything. And then they put another fridge in there in their garage. So it just, you can't expand your way out of that. It's I mean, there's a quote in the book from a Canadian architect that is like small fridges make good cities, and really good cities
yes, I
only
wrote that down in my
require
notes. Yeah.
it's just and it's that same point I was making about not stockpiling too. And listen, people have busy lives. The reality is it can be tough. And in our built environment, it can be really tough to shop more regularly. But stockpiling isn't working out for us because
Mm.
you buy all this produce at the start of the week. You think you're going to eat healthy, stuff happens, you order takeout instead, you don't feel like it's cold and you don't feel like a salad anymore. All of these things and the produce goes to waste. And in the meantime, you've got this overstuffed fridge. It's getting worse while it waits. It's just not a great way of feeding ourselves, and we can do better.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a cultural change there, incorporated in our education in schools where we learn more about how to prepare our meals and why and waste and just pay attention to what's in our refrigerator.
Right.
Um, I want to talk about
Yeah.
a few more things before you go, and the time is going very quickly. We need to chill the time here so it slows down
It's
somehow.
me. Once I start talking about this, I can't stop. I'm sorry. So you can see why I just got very deep into this book.
No, it's a good thing. So let's talk about appeal, which I know some of my listeners know about because we're all passionate about food and we're kind of concerned about the technology and the innovations to make our food better, and it isn't always better. And when we're adding some sort of chemical to our food. Now, I know there are good chemicals and there are bad chemicals. Water
All
is a
your food is
chemical.
already made of chemicals. Yeah.
We can't live without chemicals. But there are some artificial, synthetic, man-made things that maybe we don't want in or on our food. And so when we hear about appeal, it raises some alarms. And when I read the description in your book, I felt a little better about it. But, and that maybe it could actually help in the sustainable part of keeping our food fresh without refrigeration.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. And listen, it comes back to this idea of technology in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's how we implement it. It is what ends it serves. And I think, the interesting thing about appeal is here you have a coating. Um, at the time I visited them, they were actually sourcing all of the materials for the coating from food itself, from food waste. In fact, they were mining like avocado pits and tomato peel and like the byproducts. They're here in California. There's a lot of vegetable kind of waste,
Hmm.
essentially. It is still rich in, it's primarily lipids, so just fats. That you can use. And so this is food. It's a food based spray for food. They're actually now, just for commercial scale purposes and sort of um, reproducibility, so that something's the same every time, they're
Hmm.
using fats, the same fats that are used in baby formula. So very safe. I mean, people feed it to their babies. It's like a safe product. Um, uh, FDA regulated, etc.
Is it still sourced from plants?
That's a great question. I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's not a animal bait. Oh, yeah, yeah. No, 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 no. Yeah, it's not a. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean,
Uh,
yeah, that would
yeah.
be that. No, it's yeah, no, it's a plant-based product. And so what they've done is basically take the insight that you're trying to slow down metabolism and say, okay, for an apple in a warehouse in Washington, we do that by reducing the oxygen levels. For a salad leaf in a bag, we do it by having a plastic film that reduces the amount of oxygen that gets in. That we were talking about the salad bags earlier and the technology there. What if we made a coating? This is nanoscale, so it's so tiny you can't detect it. But what if we made a coating of these food based particles, this fat based? What if we made a coating that slowed the oxygen going in? And they've done it. It's kind of incredible how well it works. I mean, they're able, with some produce, to achieve the same kind of shelf life extension that you get with refrigeration, just at ambient temperature. So I visited their, lab, and there are bell peppers coated in this, this lipid based nano coating that are 8 weeks old, and next to them are at room temperature,
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
you wouldn't put them on your crudité platter, but you would put them in a stir fry. So, I mean, they're still in pretty good shape. And so the thing that that is important about this, I think, is a couple of things. First of all, people are like, oh, no, no, I don't want coatings. Well, to my mind, if it's just plant-based fats being sprayed in a particular configuration that changes the oxygen inflow into a plant, I don't have a problem with that. That's something that is perfectly edible. Um, I think the other thing that is important is this is actually, and this is, we talked about freshness earlier. This is a guy who was like, I think freshness should mean it has more of the stuff we want in it. And the appeal coating is doing that. It's actually preserving more of the nutrients in it. So to me, that's amazing. Then, if you're saying, well, we could take, at the moment in the US, it's being used to extend shelf life even further. So the fruit or vegetable still gets refrigerated, but now it can last even longer.
Hmm.
The goal is to say, hey, and this will probably be in Rwanda rather than here, because in the US, people are obsessed with refrigeration, and they, whatever. But hey, you could use this instead. And this is something that is a white block of powder that you can dissolve in water and spray onto produce. And now a farmer in Rwanda can preserve their produce, but they don't need to invest in refrigeration, which is something that doesn't work at that scale, is not economically viable at that scale. Whereas a spray, totally economically viable at that scale. Also, for the fruits and vegetables that don't work in the cold. So we talked about all those apple varieties you can get at the farmer's market, but you can't get, and the biodiversity, especially in countries that haven't got a refrigerated cold chain and grow varieties that can't be refrigerated and are now switching to commercial varieties that can be refrigerated, and we're losing all that crop biodiversity. Well, this works on everything. So you don't have to, only use the commercial variety. So I think I mean, I'm not being paid by these people, although I was like, wow, can I invest? This is so smart. But no, you have to be a venture capitalist to invest right now. But I think there's, for me, and it remains to be seen whether it will succeed. There's a lot of pushback because people are like, oh, I don't want chemicals on my food, which
Yep.
I just think is sort of like, hey, let's inform ourselves a little. And there's also people saying, oh, I don't want my food to be older. And it's like, well, also, let's inform ourselves a little. Like, it already is old. Um, so, I think for me, I was really excited to think about, refrigeration is just one method of preserving food. It's not necessarily the best method. What are there ways of doing this better in ways that have consequences that are better for the environment, better for nutrition, better for flavor, better for biodiversity, better for the developing world? Possibly. So and this that I don't have a crystal ball, but to me, it's incredibly important that we think of these new technologies and we don't say, oh, refrigeration is the only thing.
Well, I appreciated reading about it, and I have a more open perspective about the product now, and I'm gonna read a little bit more about it, but it gave me a little peace of mind.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt very comfortable with it after visiting. I'll say that.
Mm. Okay, just like 1 minute maybe. You talk about it in the book, whether refrigeration has been a good thing in terms of health for people. And you talked about studies. It's very difficult to kind of glean if it really is so many other things going on. And now we're learning about the microbiome. But what do you think? Is
I
it
mean,
healthy for us? We don't know. Some things are good, some things,
yeah, there's no, I, at the end of that chapter, I could not come to a
yeah,
conclusion
that's the
because,
impression I got.
yeah, something's good, something's bad. And I guess what my takeaway from it is now that we know that, well, are there ways around it? So, one of the things you mentioned, the microbiome, well, you know, we, food preservation and fermentation and pickling has such benefits for our microbiome. We know that. Let's pull some produce in, like let's divert some of our attention from fresh produce and go back to that and incorporate more produce that's preserved that way into our diet. Like we can, there are pros and cons. There are huge pros. Reduction in stomach cancer because we are eating less
Eating less
salt.
salt.
Huge. So I don't think it's possible to really come down on the side of uh, it's been a win or it hasn't. One thing you can definitely say is in environmental terms, it's got a huge cost that we have to deal with. But obviously the health of our planet is our own health in the end. But for on a very sort of particular level, I think the thing to do is know the downsides and say, okay, can we do better?
Well, that's a good way to wrap it up. Nicola Twilley, thank you so much for joining me and for writing this amazing book, Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. I really enjoyed it. You really dug deep and went to places where nobody wants to go. You experienced that cold. Wow, just amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, take care, and everybody have a delicious week.